The voicemail was left at 2:47 a.m., which meant Dad had been drinking again, which meant whatever he was about to say would cut deeper than any sober conversation ever could. I pressed play while sitting in my penthouse apartment in downtown Millbrook, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city that had no idea a girl from Ridgemont Trailer Park now owned 3 buildings in their financial district. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lily, it's your father. His voice was slurred, bitter, the same tone he'd used when I was 12, and accidentally broke his beer bottle. Your mother and I have been talking, and we've decided you're not welcome at Thanksgiving this year, or Christmas, or any family gathering for that matter. A pause. Ice clinking in a glass. We're tired of you pretending to be something you're not. Walking around in those fancy clothes, driving that ridiculous car, acting like you're better than us. We know the truth, Lily. We know you're probably selling drugs or doing something illegal to afford all that fake luxury. We raised you better than to be a liar and a fraud. Another pause, longer this time, and I could hear Mom crying in the background, not defending me, never defending me, just crying because that's all she ever did when Dad made his declarations. Don't call us back. Don't show up at the house. We're done pretending your little fantasy life is real. Find yourself a new family, because you're no daughter of mine. The line went dead. I sat there for 10 minutes, still holding the phone, watching the city lights blur through tears I hadn't expected to fall. My name is Lily Ashford, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Because sometimes the family that throws you away for being fake discovers just how real your success actually is. 3 years. 3 years since I'd started my tech consulting company from a borrowed laptop in the Riverside Community College library. 3 years since I'd moved out of the cramped apartment I shared with 2 roommates in the worst part of Clearwater. 3 years since I'd stopped asking my parents for gas money and started building something they couldn't understand and refused to believe. But here's what they didn't know yet, what they couldn't see past their own assumptions and prejudices about their worthless daughter who dropped out of nursing school to play with computers. Yesterday, the IRS had called to discuss my tax obligations as someone whose annual income had just crossed the 7-figure threshold. Yesterday, my accountant had congratulated me on officially becoming a millionaire at 26. Yesterday, I'd signed a contract to sell my software platform to a Fortune 500 company for $3.2 million. And today, my father had left a voicemail calling me a fraud. The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. I walked to my kitchen, yes, my kitchen in my apartment that I owned, not rented, and poured myself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than my parents' monthly rent. Not because I was showing off, but because I'd worked 90-hour weeks for 3 years straight, and I'd earned the right to drink good wine in my own home while processing the fact that my family had officially disowned me for being too successful. This wasn't the first time they'd questioned my lifestyle. When I'd moved to Millbrook and started my business, Dad had laughed and said, "Computers? Lily, you can barely balance a checkbook. Who's going to pay you to mess around on the internet?" When I'd bought my first car, nothing fancy, just a reliable Honda that wasn't held together with duct tape and prayers, Mom had asked suspiciously, "Where did you get the money for this? You better not be doing anything you shouldn't be doing." When I'd invited them to my new apartment last year, Dad had walked through every room with the expression of someone inspecting a crime scene, muttering under his breath about drug money and sugar daddies, because in his mind, there was no possible way his failure of a daughter could have legitimately earned enough to live somewhere nice. I'd tried to explain the business. I'd shown them the contracts, the client testimonials, the revenue reports. Dad had waved it all away with, "I don't understand all this computer nonsense, but I know you can't make real money sitting at a desk clicking buttons." Mom had nodded along because she always nodded along, because questioning Dad was scarier than accepting his version of reality. So they'd convinced themselves I was living a lie, that the success was fake, the money was dirty, the business was a front for something criminal. It was easier to believe their daughter was a fraud than to accept they'd been wrong about her potential. But tomorrow morning, I had a meeting with my financial advisor to discuss investment strategies for my new millions. Tomorrow afternoon, I had a call with a reporter from Tech Business Weekly who wanted to feature my company in their Young Entrepreneurs to Watch section. Tomorrow evening, I had dinner reservations at Chez Laurent, the restaurant where I'd once been too embarrassed to apply for a waitressing job because I knew they'd take one look at my thrift store clothes and turn me away. My parents thought they were cutting out a pretender, a fake, a daughter who'd forgotten where she came from. What they didn't realize was that they'd just disowned a millionaire who'd spent 3 years trying to make them proud, sending anonymous payments to help with their bills, planning to surprise them with a house in a better neighborhood for Christmas. I looked out at the city lights, at the empire I'd built from nothing but determination and late nights and more rejection than any 26-year-old should have to handle, and I made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to cut me out for being a fraud, they were about to learn exactly how real their fake daughter had become. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Let me tell you who I really am, because my parents clearly forgot somewhere along the way. My name is Lily Ashford, and I'm 26 years old. I grew up in Ridgemont, a collection of double-wide trailers and broken dreams, about 40 minutes outside of Millbrook, where the biggest excitement on any given Friday night was whether the gas station would stay open past 9 or if someone's cousin was throwing another party that would end with police sirens and regret. My father, Robert Ashford, worked construction when his back wasn't acting up and when he could pass the random drug tests. My mother, Janet, cleaned houses for wealthy families in Millbrook, the same families whose neighborhood I now call home, though she doesn't know that yet. My younger brother, Danny, still lives with them at 24, bouncing between part-time jobs and full-time disappointment. But he's always been Dad's favorite because he never challenged anything, never dreamed bigger than what was expected. I was different from the start. While other kids in Ridgemont were content to accept that this was as good as life got, I was the one asking why. Why did we have to struggle every month to pay rent? Why couldn't we take vacations like the families Mom cleaned for? Why did Dad always say people like us don't get lucky breaks whenever I talked about college or careers or anything beyond the trailer park boundaries? In high school, I was the girl who stayed after class to use the computer lab because we couldn't afford internet at home. I was the one who walked 2 miles to the public library every day to do homework, because it was quiet there, peaceful, and filled with books about places I wanted to see, and people who'd built something from nothing. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, saw something in me. She helped me apply for scholarships, filled out financial aid forms, and convinced me that college was possible even when my parents said it was a waste of time and money we didn't have. Education is how you change your stars, Lily, she used to say, and I held on to those words like a lifeline. But here's what nobody tells you about being the first person in your family to dream bigger. Every step forward feels like a betrayal to the people you're leaving behind. When I got accepted to Riverside Community College with partial scholarships, Dad said, "College is for rich kids and people who think they're too good for honest work." When I changed my major from nursing, his choice because at least nurses make decent money, to computer science, he stopped speaking to me for 2 weeks. Mom tried to be supportive in her quiet way, but she was always caught between wanting what was best for me and keeping peace with Dad. "Maybe you could just do the nursing program," she'd whisper when he wasn't around. "It would make him so proud, and you'd still be helping people." She never understood that I wasn't trying to hurt him by choosing a different path. I was trying to save myself. The thing about growing up poor isn't just the lack of money, it's the lack of belief that you deserve anything better. It's watching your parents work themselves to exhaustion just to keep the lights on and thinking that's what life is supposed to look like. It's being told that people like us don't start businesses, don't take risks, don't reach for things that seem impossible. But I had this hunger inside me, this restless energy that wouldn't let me settle. While my friends were planning their weddings or their next dead-end jobs, I was learning programming languages from library books and YouTube videos. While they were at parties, I was building websites for local businesses for $50 each, saving every penny in a coffee can under my bed. I wasn't trying to abandon my family or prove I was better than them. I was trying to prove that we were capable of more than we'd been told. I wanted to show them that someone from Ridgemont could build something real, something lasting, something that would change not just my life but theirs too. After 2 years at Riverside, I had enough credits and enough savings to transfer to Millbrook University. The day I moved out, Mom cried and packed me a cooler full of sandwiches. Dad shook my hand and said, "Don't forget where you came from, Lily. And don't come back thinking you're too good for us." I never thought I was too good for them. I thought they deserved better than what they'd settled for, and I was determined to be the one who could give it to them. For the next 4 years, I worked 3 jobs while finishing my degree. I tutored other students in programming. I waited tables at a diner near campus. And I freelanced web design projects until my eyes burned from staring at screens. I lived on ramen noodles and determination, sending money home whenever I could spare it, calling every Sunday to check in, visiting for holidays, even when Dad made subtle digs about my fancy education, and how I was probably too smart for my own good now. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science and a business plan I'd been refining for 2 years. While my classmates were sending out resumes and hoping someone would hire them, I was preparing to hire myself. 3 years ago, I started Ashford Solutions from my cramped studio apartment in the worst part of Millbrook. I had a used laptop, a dream, and a bone-deep certainty that I could build something that mattered. My parents thought I was throwing my education away to play with computers. They had no idea I was about to build an empire. What they also didn't know was that every success, every milestone, every victory was motivated by one driving desire: to make them proud enough to finally believe in me the way Mrs. Patterson had believed in me all those years ago. That belief was about to be tested in ways none of us saw coming. I need to be honest with you about something that might sound crazy. I spent the first 24 years of my life apologizing for wanting more than what I was given. Not out loud, but in the way I walked, talked, and dreamed smaller whenever I was around my family. Growing up in the Ashford household meant learning a very specific set of rules that were never written down but were carved into the foundation of our double-wide-like commandments. Rule number 1. Don't get above your raising. Rule number 2. People like us work with our hands, not our heads. Rule number 3. Dreams are for people who can afford to fail, and we couldn't afford anything. When I was 8 years old, I told my dad I wanted to be a scientist. He laughed. Not maliciously, but with the kind of dismissive chuckle you give a child who says they want to be a unicorn. "Scientists need fancy schools and rich parents," he said, ruffling my hair. "You'll find something more realistic to do." I never mentioned science again, but I kept checking out library books about space and computers and inventions, hiding them under my mattress like other kids hid contraband. At 10, I discovered the computer lab at school and fell in love with the way problems had solutions, the way code followed logical patterns, the way I could create something from nothing but keystrokes and imagination. I begged Mom to ask Dad if we could get a computer at home. The answer was always the same. Those things are expensive toys for spoiled kids. You don't need one. Instead, I learned to be grateful for 30 minutes twice a week in the school lab, staying after class to help the teacher organize files, just so I could spend extra time at the keyboard. Mrs. Henderson, the computer teacher, noticed my enthusiasm and started letting me come in during lunch periods. "You've got a natural talent for this, Lily," she'd say, showing me programming basics that weren't part of the curriculum. "Don't let anyone tell you technology isn't for girls like you." But at home, my talent was seen as another sign that I was getting ideas above my station. When I excitedly told my parents about learning to build websites, Dad said, "That's nice, honey, but you can't eat computers." When I showed them a simple program I'd written to balance a checkbook, Mom said, "That's very smart, But what happens when the power goes out? You still need to know how to do things the real way. Every achievement came with a qualifier, every success, with a reminder not to get too big for my britches. When I made honor roll, the response was, just don't let it go to your head. When I won the school science fair with a project about network security, Dad said, it's good that you're smart, but book smarts don't pay the bills. When I got accepted into the National Honor Society, Mom worried out loud that I was spending too much time with those brainy kids, and not enough time learning practical skills. The message was clear: be proud of me, but not too proud. Succeed, but not too much. Dream, but keep those dreams small enough that they wouldn't upset the family equilibrium. High school was when the real tension started. While my classmates were talking about college visits and SAT prep, my parents were dropping hints about me getting a job after graduation. Your cousin Melissa got her cosmetology license right out of high school. Mom would mention casually, she's making good money at that salon in Clearwater. Or Dad would point out openings at the factory, where he sometimes picked up work. They're hiring for the office. You're good with numbers, you could probably handle that. They weren't trying to hold me back out of malice. In their minds, they were protecting me from disappointment, steering me towards stability, helping me avoid the kind of failure that comes from reaching too high. But what they saw as protection, I experienced as suffocation. The breaking point came during my junior year when Mrs. Patterson called a meeting with my parents to discuss my college potential. I remember sitting in those uncomfortable plastic chairs in the guidance office, watching Dad's face grow tighter with every word about scholarships and university programs and career opportunities in technology. Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Patterson said with genuine enthusiasm, Lily has extraordinary potential in computer science. Her grades, her aptitude scores, her project work. She could easily get into a 4-year program with significant financial aid. She could have a real future in tech. Dad shifted in his seat. That's real nice to hear, but we're simple people. We don't know anything about computers or colleges or any of that. Lily's a smart girl, but she needs to be realistic about what's possible for someone like her. With respect, Mr. Ashford, Mrs. Patterson continued, someone like Lily is exactly who these programs are designed for. She's brilliant, motivated, and she comes from a background that would make her eligible for need-based aid. The only thing holding her back would be... She didn't finish the sentence, but we all knew what she meant. The only thing holding me back would be my family's belief that I wasn't meant for more. That night, Dad sat me down for what he called a reality check. Listen, sweetheart, he said, using the gentle tone he reserved for serious conversations. I know that teacher filled your head with big ideas today, but I need you to understand something. People like us, we don't get fairy tale endings. We work hard, we take care of our families, and we don't go chasing after things we can't catch. He meant it kindly. He thought he was saving me from heartbreak, teaching me to appreciate what we had instead of mourning what we couldn't have. But what I heard was, you're not special enough for special things. What I felt was, your dreams are too big for your circumstances. What I learned was, wanting more than this makes you ungrateful for what you've been given. So I learned to keep my mouth shut about the future I was planning. I stopped mentioning college applications around the dinner table. I nodded when they talked about practical careers and realistic expectations. I smiled when they said things like, you'll always have a place here at home, as if staying in Ridgemont forever was a gift rather than a limitation. But late at night, when the trailer was quiet and everyone was asleep, I filled out scholarship applications by flashlight. I researched university programs and internship opportunities and career paths that led away from everything my parents thought was inevitable for me. I planned my escape not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I was slowly dying inside from the weight of their low expectations. They loved me. I never doubted that, but they loved a version of me that fit their understanding of what daughters from Ridgemont were supposed to become. They couldn't love the version of me that wanted to build software companies and own high-rise apartments, and prove that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. For years, I told myself their doubt would turn to pride once I succeeded. I convinced myself that every "be realistic" and "don't get your hopes up" was just protective instinct that would transform into celebration once I proved them wrong. I had no idea how deep their need for me to stay small actually ran, or how much my success would threaten the story they'd told themselves about our family's place in the world. The specific moment everything shattered wasn't dramatic in the way you'd expect. There was no screaming fight, no thrown objects, no door-slamming finale. It was quiet, surgical, and infinitely more devastating because of how calm it all seemed on the surface. It was a Tuesday in October, exactly 3 weeks after I'd signed the biggest contract in my company's history, a year-long consulting deal with Meridian Financial that would generate $1.8 million in revenue. I was riding high on success, finally ready to share the good news with my family, finally prepared to prove that all those years of their doubt had been misplaced. I'd driven down to Ridgemont that morning with a trunk full of gifts and a heart full of hope. For Dad, I'd brought a new tool set, top-of-the-line Craftsman tools that I knew he'd been wanting but could never justify buying. For Mom, a spa day package at the resort in Millbrook, where she'd always wondered what it would be like to be pampered instead of doing the pampering. For Danny, concert tickets to see his favorite band, seats so good they cost more than he made in a month at his current job. But more than the gifts, I brought news. I brought proof. I brought contracts and financial statements and a business plan that showed exactly how far I'd come from the girl they thought was chasing impossible dreams. I should have known something was wrong the moment I walked into the trailer. Mom was washing dishes that were already clean, the way she did when she was nervous. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with Danny, both of them wearing expressions I couldn't quite read. The conversation stopped abruptly when I entered, and the silence stretched long enough to make my stomach clench. "Hey, family," I said, forcing brightness into my voice. "I brought presents and some incredible news to share." Dad didn't look up from his coffee cup. "Before you start with whatever story you're here to tell us, we need to have a conversation." The word story hit me like a slap. Not news or update story. As if everything I was about to share was fiction. Elaborate lies designed to impress them. "Okay," I said carefully, setting my purse on the counter but keeping my distance. "What's going on?" Danny shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom's dishwashing became more aggressive. Dad finally looked at me, and his expression was a mixture of disappointment and something else. Something that looked almost like pity. "Sit down, Lily." I remained standing. Something primal in my brain was already preparing for flight, even though I didn't yet understand why. "We got a visit yesterday," Dad continued, his voice taking on that measured tone he used when he was trying to stay calm. "From your landlord in Millbrook, a Mr. Harrison Chen." My blood went cold. Harrison Chen wasn't my landlord. He was my property manager, the man who handled rent collection for the 3 apartment buildings I'd recently purchased as investment properties. But there was no way my parents would know that distinction, and clearly Chen hadn't bothered to clarify his actual relationship to me. "He seemed real concerned about you," Dad went on. "Said you'd been behind on rent for months. That you'd been spinning stories about having money when really you were about to be evicted. Said he'd driven all the way out here because you'd listed us as emergency contacts and he was worried about your mental state." The room started spinning. Harrison Chen, who I'd trusted to manage my properties professionally, had driven to Ridgemont to tell my parents I was delusional. The same Harrison Chen who collected tens of thousands in rent payments on my behalf every month had convinced my family that I was a broke fantasist living beyond my means. "He showed us pictures," Mom added quietly, not turning around from the sink. "Pictures of your apartment, your car, your lifestyle. He said people like you sometimes create elaborate lies when they can't face reality. He said you might need professional help." I felt like I was drowning in slow motion. "And you believed him?" A complete stranger shows up at your door with stories about your daughter, and you just believed him? It made sense, Lily, Danny said, speaking for the first time. His voice was gentle but firm, the way you'd talk to someone having a breakdown. We've been worried about you for months. The expensive clothes, the fancy apartment, the car, the stories about your business. It never added up. We know what you were making at that tutoring job before you moved to Millbrook. I haven't worked at a tutoring center in over 2 years, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I own a consulting company. I have contracts with major corporations. I just signed a deal worth nearly $2 million. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad shook his head slowly, sadly, like I'd just confirmed his worst fears about my mental health. "Sweetheart," he said, using that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl, "we love you, but this has gone too far." Mr. Chen explained how people sometimes create these fantasies when they're struggling. He said it's not uncommon for young people to make up success stories to avoid disappointing their families. You think I'm lying. It wasn't a question. The realization hit me like a physical blow. You think I've been lying to you for 3 years. We think you're sick, Mom said, finally turning to face me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and worried. We think you need help, and we want to help you, but not if you're going to keep living in this fantasy world. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, hands shaking as I navigated to my banking app. Look, I said, showing them the screen. Look at my account balance. Look at the deposits from client payments. Look at the business checking account. Dad waved it away without looking. Anyone can fake things on a computer, Lily. Mr. Chen warned us you might try to show us fake documents or manipulated screenshots. That's when I understood the full scope of what had happened. Harrison Chen hadn't just told them I was broke. He'd preemptively discredited any evidence I might try to show them. He'd painted me as not just delusional, but crafty in my delusions, sophisticated in my lies. Every piece of proof I offered would be seen as further evidence of my elaborate fantasy. The gifts I brought, I said desperately. The expensive gifts. Where do you think I got the money for those? Credit cards, Danny said matter-of-factly. Probably maxed out credit cards, just like Mr. Chen said. He told us that people in your condition often go into massive debt to maintain their fake lifestyle until it all comes crashing down. I looked around the room at these 3 people who had raised me, who claimed to love me, who were now looking at me like I was a stranger having a psychotic break. The worst part wasn't their disbelief. It was how relieved they seemed, how satisfied they appeared to have their suspicions confirmed, their worldview validated. Deep down, they had wanted me to fail. They had needed me to fail, because my success made their limitations feel like choices rather than inevitabilities. It was easier to believe I was mentally ill than to accept that everything they'd told themselves about what people like us could achieve had been wrong. So what now? I asked, my voice hollow. Now you come home, Mom said, reaching for me. You move back here where we can take care of you. You get the help you need. You stop living this lie and start building a real life based on reality, not fantasy. I stepped back from her outstretched hand. And if I refuse? Dad's expression hardened. Then you're not welcome here until you're ready to admit you have a problem and get professional help. We're not going to enable your delusions anymore, Lily. We love you too much to watch you destroy yourself with these lies. That's when I realized the true cruelty of what Harrison Chen had done. He hadn't just convinced them I was broke. He'd given them permission to reject my success without feeling guilty about it. He'd provided them with a framework where abandoning me was actually an act of love, where refusing to believe in me was actually helping me. I picked up my purse and headed for the door. You're right about one thing, I said without turning around. Someone in this family has been living a lie, but it isn't me. I walked out of that trailer knowing I would never walk back in. Not as their daughter, not as the person they claimed to love. Because the person they loved was a fiction, a small, struggling, appropriately grateful version of me that had never actually existed. What they didn't know was that they'd just rejected a millionaire who had spent 3 years planning to change their lives forever. What they couldn't see was that their delusional daughter was about to prove exactly how real her success had become. The breaking point hadn't been an explosion. It had been a careful dismantling of everything I'd thought we shared, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but the foundation of their need for me to fail. And I was done building on that foundation. I drove back to Millbrook in a fog of rage and disbelief, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. The gifts I'd brought, the expensive tools, the spa package, the concert tickets, sat unopened in my trunk like evidence of my own naivete. But it was the Harrison Chen situation that kept playing on repeat in my mind, each detail more infuriating than the last. Harrison Chen, the property manager I'd hired 6 months ago to handle day-to-day operations for my real estate investments. The same man who collected over $40,000 in monthly rent payments on my behalf. The same man who had access to my tenant files, my property records, and apparently my personal emergency contact information. By the time I reached my penthouse, I was operating on pure adrenaline and a fury so cold it felt like clarity. I didn't pour wine, didn't sit down, didn't even take off my coat. I went straight to my home office and pulled up every piece of documentation related to Harrison Chen and Chen Property Management. What I found in the next 3 hours of digging changed everything. First, I discovered that Harrison Chen wasn't just my property manager. He was running what appeared to be a sophisticated rental fraud operation. Using the emergency contact information from my files, he'd been contacting the families of several young property owners, spinning elaborate stories about their children's financial difficulties and mental health concerns. My parents weren't the only ones who'd received his visit. The pattern was always the same: young, successful property owner with family who couldn't quite believe their child's rapid financial success. Chen would show up unannounced, presenting himself as a concerned landlord rather than an employee, painting a picture of their child as delusional, broke, and potentially dangerous. Then he'd offer to help by taking over the properties at below-market rates, positioning himself as the responsible adult stepping in to clean up the mess. But that was just the beginning. Digging deeper into the financial records, I discovered that Chen had been skimming from my rental income for months. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there that could be explained as maintenance costs or administrative fees. But as my trust in him grew, so did his theft. In the past 3 months alone, he'd diverted nearly $15,000 from my accounts into shell companies he controlled. The more I uncovered, the clearer his strategy became. He wasn't just stealing money. He was systematically undermining my credibility with my own family while positioning himself to take over my properties. By convincing my parents I was mentally unstable and financially delusional, he was laying the groundwork for a narrative where his eventual takeover of my assets would seem like a rescue operation rather than theft. It was brilliant, really. Sociopathic, but brilliant. I sat back in my chair, staring at spreadsheets full of evidence, and felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion from this afternoon began crystallizing into something harder, more focused. Harrison Chen had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed that, like most young people, I would crumble under the combined pressure of family rejection and professional betrayal. He'd counted on me being too inexperienced, too emotional, or too isolated to fight back effectively. What he didn't know was that I'd spent 3 years building not just a business but a network, not just wealth but resources, not just success but power. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed: Marcus Rivera, a forensic accountant I'd met at a networking event 6 months earlier. Marcus specialized in financial fraud cases, particularly those involving real estate and property management. We'd grabbed coffee a few times, and he'd mentioned that rental fraud was becoming increasingly sophisticated, targeting young property owners who might not have the experience to spot the warning signs. "Marcus," I said when he picked up, "it's Lily Ashford. I need your help, and I need it fast." "Lily, good to hear from you. What's going on?" I gave him the abbreviated version. Property manager accessing my personal information, visiting my family with false claims about my financial status, evidence of fund diversion, and what appeared to be a pattern of similar behavior with other clients. The line was quiet for a long moment. Then Marcus said, "Lily, if what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't just fraud. This is organized, systematic fraud on a scale that would interest federal authorities. How much documentation do you have?" "Everything," I said, looking at the pile of printouts and digital files I'd accumulated. Bank records, rental agreements, maintenance invoices that don't match actual work performed, email communications, and I'm pretty sure I can identify at least 3 other victims if we dig into his client database. "Don't touch that client database," Marcus said immediately. "We need to do this by the book so nothing gets thrown out in court. Can you be in my office tomorrow morning at 8? And Lily, don't contact Chen or anyone in his organization. Don't let them know you're on to them yet." After I hung up with Marcus, I called my business attorney, Patricia Wong. Patricia had helped me structure my original business entity and had been guiding me through the legal complexities of my recent expansion. If anyone would know how to protect my assets while building a case against Chen, it would be her. "Patricia, I need an emergency consultation, tonight if possible." "Lily, you sound stressed. What's happened?" I explained the situation again, focusing on the immediate legal implications. Patricia listened without interrupting, and I could hear her taking notes. "First things first," she said when I finished. "We need to secure your assets. I'm going to draft an emergency injunction to freeze any accounts Chen has access to, and we need to immediately revoke his management authority over your properties. Second, we're going to file a formal complaint with the State Real Estate Commission. Third, depending on what the forensic accounting turns up, we may be looking at both civil and criminal proceedings." "How long will all this take?" "The asset protection can happen within 24 hours. The formal legal process, that could take months. But Lily, if he's been doing this to multiple victims, law enforcement is going to be very interested. Financial fraud that crosses state lines becomes a federal matter very quickly." By midnight, I had 3 different investigations in motion. Marcus was launching a comprehensive forensic audit, Patricia was preparing emergency legal filings, and I was compiling a detailed timeline of Chen's activities for what would likely become a federal case. But as I sat in my office surrounded by evidence of Harrison Chen's elaborate fraud scheme, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't thinking about him anymore. The rage had burned through me and left something else in its place, a cold, calculating determination that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with power. Chen had made his move thinking I was just another naive young property owner who could be easily manipulated and discredited. He'd involved my family in his scheme, used their own prejudices against me, and turned their love into a weapon to destroy my credibility. What he'd actually done was hand me the keys to dismantling not just his operation, but the entire network of people who profited from convincing successful young people that their achievements were illusions. In trying to prove I was delusional, Harrison Chen had given me access to a level of legal and financial leverage I'd never imagined possessing. In convincing my family I was mentally unstable, he'd freed me from any obligation to protect their feelings when the truth came out. The man who thought he was stealing my properties had actually handed me something much more valuable: absolute clarity about who I was dealing with, and absolute freedom to respond without limits. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, I was going to savor the irony that in trying to destroy me, Harrison Chen had just made me more dangerous than I'd ever dreamed of being. He'd wanted to teach me a lesson about knowing my place. He was about to learn what happens when you underestimate someone who spent their entire life proving people wrong. The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m. with the kind of clarity that only comes after a sleepless night spent planning war. I'd spent the hours between midnight and dawn creating what I privately called Operation Clean House, a comprehensive strategy to not only take down Harrison Chen, but to ensure that every person who'd enabled his fraud faced consequences proportional to their involvement. My first stop was Marcus Rivera's office at 8 sharp. I arrived with 3 bankers' boxes full of documentation, 2 laptops containing digital evidence, and a timeline so detailed it read like a prosecution brief. Marcus took one look at the materials I'd organized and whistled low under his breath. "Lily, I've been doing forensic accounting for 15 years, and I've never seen a victim come this prepared. Most people bring me a shoebox full of receipts and a vague sense that something's wrong. You've built a federal case." We spent the next 4 hours going through everything. Marcus's initial assessment was even worse than I'd suspected. Chen's operation wasn't just sophisticated. It was part of a larger network that had been targeting young property owners across 3 states. The rental fraud, the family manipulation, the systematic asset theft. It was all connected to what appeared to be an organized effort to transfer wealth from inexperienced investors to established players in the real estate market. The beauty of his scheme, Marcus explained, pulling up financial records on his computer, is that he's exploiting 2 very specific vulnerabilities. First, the fact that many young, successful people come from families who can't quite believe their success is real. Second, the fact that property management fraud is notoriously difficult to detect until significant damage has been done. But Chen had made one critical error in his approach with me. In his eagerness to isolate me from my support system, he'd accelerated his timeline. Instead of slowly escalating the fraud over months or years, he'd gone nuclear by involving my family directly. That desperation suggested he was under pressure from his own backers, which meant his operation was vulnerable. "We're going to need federal investigators," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "This crosses state lines, involves wire fraud, identity theft, and possibly RICO violations if we can prove the organized nature of the network. But Lily, I need you to understand something. Once we make this formal, there's no going back. Chen and his associates are going to know you're the one who brought them down." I smiled for the first time in 24 hours. "Marcus, I'm counting on that." From Marcus's office, I went directly to Patricia Wong's law firm. Patricia had been busy overnight as well, and when I arrived, she had a stack of legal documents ready for my signature. Emergency injunctions to freeze accounts, cease and desist orders, formal complaints to regulatory agencies, and what she called the nuclear option, a comprehensive lawsuit that would expose Chen's entire operation to public scrutiny. "Before we file any of this," Patricia said, spreading the documents across her conference table, "I need to ask you something important. Are you prepared for your family to find out exactly how wrong they were about your financial situation? Because once these proceedings begin, your net worth is going to become part of the public record." I thought about my parents sitting in that trailer yesterday, so satisfied with their conclusion that I was mentally ill, so relieved to have their limited worldview confirmed. I thought about Danny nodding along with their assessment, so eager to believe his sister was delusional rather than successful. I thought about their faces when they realized that the daughter they'd rejected for being fake was actually a millionaire who'd been planning to change their lives forever. "File everything," I said. "I want full transparency." While Patricia's team worked on the legal filings, I made 3 phone calls that would set the rest of my strategy in motion. The first was to Jessica Torres, an investigative journalist I'd met at a Women in Business conference. Jessica specialized in exposing financial fraud that targeted young entrepreneurs, and she'd been looking for a story that would illustrate how traditional family dynamics could be weaponized by sophisticated fraudsters. "Jessica, it's Lily Ashford. Remember that conversation we had about rental fraud targeting young property owners? I think I have the story you've been looking for." Jessica's response was immediate. "Tell me everything." The second call was to Dr. Sarah Kim, a forensic psychologist who consulted on fraud cases involving family manipulation. I'd found her contact information through my attorney's network, and her expertise was exactly what I needed to understand the psychological components of Chen's operation. Dr. Kim, I'm calling because I believe I'm the victim of what you might call weaponized family dynamics. Someone has used my family's pre-existing doubts about my success to isolate me professionally and personally, and I need to understand the psychology behind that strategy. Dr. Kim was fascinated by the case. What you're describing is extremely sophisticated psychological manipulation. The perpetrator has essentially turned your family's love for you into a tool for your destruction. Can you come in tomorrow? I'd like to document this for my research on financial abuse tactics. The third call was the most important one, and I saved it for last. Agent Diana Foster, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I'd gotten her contact information through Marcus's network, and according to her credentials, she specialized in organized financial fraud targeting real estate investors. Agent Foster, my name is Lily Ashford, and I believe I have information about an organized fraud operation that's been targeting young property owners across multiple states. My forensic accountant suggests this might be of interest to federal investigators. There was a pause. Ms. Ashford, can you hold for just a moment? When she came back on the line, her tone had shifted to something more formal, more focused. Ms. Ashford, I'm going to need you to come in as soon as possible. Based on what you've just told me, you may have information relevant to an ongoing federal investigation. That afternoon, I found myself in a conference room at the FBI field office, surrounded by agents, financial analysts, and prosecutors from the U.S. Attorney's Office. I'd brought copies of all my documentation, and for 3 hours I walked them through Chen's operation in exhaustive detail. What I learned in that room changed my understanding of everything that had happened. Harrison Chen wasn't just a criminal. He was a mid-level player in a massive fraud network that had been under federal investigation for 8 months. My case provided the missing pieces that connected his local operation to a national conspiracy involving dozens of perpetrators and hundreds of victims. Ms. Ashford, Agent Foster said as the meeting wrapped up, I need you to understand that what you've brought us today is going to result in a major federal prosecution. We're talking about charges that could send multiple people to prison for decades. Are you prepared for that level of visibility? I thought about Harrison Chen driving to Ridgemont to poison my family against me. I thought about my parents choosing to believe a stranger's lies rather than their daughter's documented success. I thought about all the other young entrepreneurs who'd been targeted by this network, all the families who'd been manipulated, all the dreams that had been systematically destroyed. Agent Foster, I said, I'm not just prepared for visibility, I'm counting on it. As I walked out of the FBI building that evening, I realized that in less than 48 hours, I had transformed from a fraud victim into the key witness in a federal prosecution. Chen had tried to isolate and discredit me, but instead, he'd handed me the resources of the entire federal law enforcement system. Tomorrow, I would start the process of taking back my properties, my reputation, and my family's understanding of who I really was. But tonight, I was going to plan exactly how I wanted them to learn the truth. Because Harrison Chen had made one final miscalculation. He'd assumed that destroying my relationship with my family would leave me powerless and alone. What he'd actually done was free me from any obligation to protect them from the consequences of their choices. They'd chosen to believe I was delusional. They were about to discover exactly how real their delusional daughter had become. 3 days after my meeting with the FBI, I was ready to make my first move. Not against Harrison Chen. The federal agents had made it clear that any direct action on my part could compromise their investigation. But there were other players in this game who weren't protected by ongoing federal proceedings, and I'd spent 72 hours identifying exactly how to hit them where it would hurt most. My target was Ridgemont Properties, the local real estate investment firm that had been Chen's primary business partner in the area. Through Marcus's forensic investigation, we discovered that Ridgemont had been the end buyer for several properties Chen had fraudulently acquired from young investors. They knew exactly what they were purchasing and from whom, but they'd structured their involvement carefully to maintain plausible deniability. The owner of Ridgemont Properties was a man named Frank Morrison, a local big shot who'd built his reputation on being the most successful real estate investor in the Tri-County area. Morrison was well known in Ridgemont, where he sponsored Little League teams and donated to the volunteer fire department. He was also, according to my research, my parents' landlord. That detail had taken me by surprise when I'd first discovered it, but it explained a lot about my family's financial situation that I'd never quite understood. The Ashfords had been renting their trailer and the small plot of land it sat on from Morrison for over 15 years, and according to county records, they were currently 3 months behind on their rent. Frank Morrison, pillar of the Ridgemont community, was also the man who would evict my family if they couldn't catch up on their payments. And Frank Morrison, respected local businessman, had been knowingly purchasing fraudulently obtained properties from Harrison Chen for nearly 2 years. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. My parents had rejected their millionaire daughter based on the lies of a criminal who was working directly with their own landlord to steal from young property owners. The same Frank Morrison who collected their rent money every month had been profiting from a scheme designed to destroy people exactly like me. I spent Tuesday morning in Patricia Wong's office, finalizing what we were calling Phase 1 of my response strategy. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I was going to purchase Ridgemont Properties. "Are you sure about this approach?" Patricia asked, reviewing the acquisition proposal we'd drafted. "A hostile takeover is going to create a lot of attention, and it's going to be expensive." I leaned back in my chair, thinking about my parents sitting in that trailer, 3 months behind on rent to a man who'd been stealing from their daughter. "Patricia, I've run the numbers. Morrison's company is leveraged to the breaking point. He's been using the profits from Chen's operation to fund expansion he couldn't otherwise afford. With Chen's pipeline cut off and federal investigators freezing related assets, Morrison's going to be in serious financial trouble within 60 days. And you want to be there when he crashes. I want to own the company when he crashes. There's a difference." The mechanics of the acquisition were surprisingly straightforward. Morrison had made the classic mistake of over-leveraging his business based on what he thought was sustainable growth. When that growth turned out to be funded by criminal activity, his entire financial structure became vulnerable. I wasn't planning a hostile takeover so much as a strategic rescue, one that would leave me in control of the company and Morrison working for me, if he was lucky. On Wednesday morning, I had Marcus Rivera call Morrison's office to schedule a meeting about potential investment opportunities in distressed real estate assets. Morrison, apparently desperate for capital, agreed to meet that same afternoon. I arrived at Morrison's office wearing my most expensive business suit and carrying a briefcase full of financial documents that would reshape his understanding of exactly who he'd been dealing with. Frank Morrison was exactly what I'd expected, mid-50s, slightly overweight, wearing a suit that cost more than most people in Ridgemont made in a month. His office was decorated with photos of himself, with local politicians, community awards, and architectural renderings of development projects that proclaimed his vision for revitalizing rural communities. "Ms. Ashford," Morrison said, shaking my hand with the kind of firm grip that men his age thought impressed young women. "I have to say, I was surprised to get a call from someone your age about real estate investment. Most people don't have the capital for serious property development until they're much more established in their careers." I smiled and took the seat across from his desk. "Mr. Morrison, I think you'll find I'm more established than you might expect." For the next 20 minutes, Morrison gave me his standard presentation about Ridgemont Properties' success, their growth trajectory, and the exciting opportunities available for investors who understood the potential of rural development. He showed me spreadsheets full of projected returns, maps of planned developments, and testimonials from satisfied partners. What he didn't know was that I'd already had Marcus audit every number he was showing me, and I knew exactly how much of his recent success had been built on property acquisitions from Harrison Chen's fraud network. When he finished his pitch, I opened my briefcase and placed a single document on his desk. "Mr. Morrison, this is a comprehensive financial analysis of Ridgemont Properties that my team completed yesterday. I think you'll find it illuminating." Morrison's confident expression began to fade as he read. The document laid out, in precise detail, his company's dependence on Chen's operation, the questionable legality of several recent acquisitions, and the financial vulnerability that dependence had created. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Morrison said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I'm not implying anything," I replied calmly. "I'm stating facts. Your company has been purchasing properties from Harrison Chen for nearly 2 years, properties that Chen acquired through fraudulent means from young investors. Those purchases are now part of a federal investigation, and the FBI has frozen assets connected to Chen's operation." Morrison's face went pale. "I had no idea that Chen was involved in anything illegal. We conducted proper due diligence on all our acquisitions." I smiled and placed a second document on his desk. "This is a copy of an email exchange between you and Chen from 6 months ago, discussing what you called motivated sellers who needed to, quote, liquidate quickly due to financial distress. The email includes your instructions to Chen about target demographics for potential acquisitions." The silence stretched long enough for Morrison to understand that I wasn't bluffing, that I had evidence of his knowing participation in Chen's scheme, and that his legal exposure was significant. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want to buy your company," I said simply. "For fair market value, minus the legal liabilities you've created through your association with Chen's operation." I placed a third document on his desk. A formal acquisition offer that valued Ridgemont Properties at roughly 60% of what Morrison probably thought it was worth, but included provisions that would protect him from criminal prosecution as long as he cooperated fully with federal investigators. "You're trying to steal my company," Morrison said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Mr. Morrison, your company is about to be destroyed by federal investigators who have evidence of your involvement in a multi-state fraud operation. I'm offering you a way to salvage something from the wreckage while ensuring that the legitimate parts of your business continue to operate." I leaned forward slightly. "And there's one more thing. I'm going to restructure the rental agreements for all residential properties currently owned by Ridgemont. No more evictions for families who are struggling financially. No more rent increases that price people out of their homes. No more treating housing as a commodity to be exploited." Morrison stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him trying to calculate his options. Fighting me meant facing federal prosecution without resources. Accepting my offer meant losing control of his company but maintaining his freedom and a significant financial payout. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. "You have until Friday at 5 p.m. After that, the offer expires, and you'll be dealing with federal prosecutors without my protection." I stood up and closed my briefcase. "Oh, and Mr. Morrison? I should mention that my parents are Robert and Janet Ashford. They rent a trailer from you on Maple Street. I believe they're currently behind on their payments." Morrison's eyes widened as the implications hit him. You're Bob Ashford's daughter? The one who what, Mr. Morrison?" He didn't answer, but I could see him connecting the dots. The delusional daughter his tenant had been complaining about was the same person who now held his company's future in her hands. "I'll expect your answer by Friday," I said, walking toward the door. "And Mr. Morrison, you might want to waive those late fees on my parents' account. Consider it a gesture of goodwill during our negotiations." As I walked out of Morrison's office, I felt the same cold satisfaction I'd experienced after meeting with the FBI. In 72 hours, I'd transformed from Chen's victim into Morrison's judge and jury. The man who'd been profiting from schemes that destroyed young entrepreneurs was about to discover what it felt like to have his life's work in the hands of someone he'd underestimated. And my parents were about to learn that their delusional daughter was now their landlord. By Thursday evening, my phone hadn't stopped ringing for 6 hours straight. The calls started coming in around noon, and they followed a predictable pattern: panic, confusion, desperate attempts at negotiation, and finally, barely contained rage when the callers realized I wasn't bluffing. The first call came from Morrison himself at 12:15 p.m. His voice had lost all pretense of the confident businessman persona he'd projected during our meeting. "Ms. Ashford, I've been thinking about your offer, and I believe we need to discuss some modifications to the terms." "I'm listening," I said, though I had no intention of modifying anything. "The valuation seems aggressive. My accountant thinks we could reach a more equitable number if we factor in the potential growth from projects already in development." I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. "Mr. Morrison, your accountant apparently hasn't seen the FBI's asset forfeiture list. 17 of your projects in development are built on properties that federal investigators have tagged as proceeds of criminal activity. Would you like me to email you the list so your accountant can recalculate?" The line went quiet. When Morrison spoke again, his voice was smaller. "What about transitional employment? I've been with this company for 22 years. Surely there's a role for someone with my experience and community connections." "There might be," I said carefully. "That would depend entirely on your cooperation with federal investigators and your willingness to make certain personal commitments regarding past business practices." "What kind of commitments?" "Full disclosure of all transactions with Chen's network, complete cooperation with victim restitution efforts, and a public acknowledgement of Ridgemont Properties' role in perpetuating fraud against young investors." Morrison's breathing became audible through the phone. "You're asking me to destroy my reputation in this community. Mr. Morrison, your reputation in this community was built on money stolen from people like me. I'm asking you to tell the truth about where that money came from." He hung up without another word. The second wave of calls started around 2 p.m., and these came from Morrison's business associates who'd apparently been briefed on the situation. Real estate developers, local politicians, bank executives, all of them suddenly very interested in having conversations with Lily Ashford about mutually beneficial arrangements and community partnerships. The most interesting call came from Mayor Helen Garrett of Ridgemont, a woman I'd never met but who apparently knew quite a lot about me. "Ms. Ashford, I'm calling because Frank Morrison has made me aware of some complications regarding Ridgemont Properties. I understand you're a local girl, and I'm hoping we can find a way to resolve this situation that benefits everyone involved." "Mayor Garrett, I appreciate your concern for the community. What specifically are you hoping to discuss?" "Well, Frank has been a significant contributor to various municipal projects over the years. His company employs a lot of local people, sponsors community events, supports local charities. I'm sure you can understand why the town council would be concerned about any disruption to those relationships." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Mayor Garrett, are you asking me to consider the economic impact of holding Mr. Morrison accountable for participating in criminal activity?" There was a pause. "I'm asking you to consider the broader implications of your actions. Small communities like Ridgemont depend on relationships, on people working together for the common good. Sometimes that means finding ways to resolve conflicts privately rather than through external authorities." "External authorities like the FBI?" Another pause, longer this time. "Ms. Ashford, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of Frank's business relationships. I'm sure any irregularities can be explained and corrected without involving federal investigators." "Mayor Garrett, Frank Morrison has been knowingly purchasing properties stolen from young investors for nearly 2 years. The, quote, irregularities you're referring to have victimized dozens of people and generated millions of dollars in fraudulent profits. Are you suggesting that I should ignore criminal activity because Mr. Morrison sponsors Little League teams? I'm suggesting that there are ways to handle these situations that don't destroy entire communities in the process. You're right, I said. There are. For instance, Mr. Morrison could have chosen not to participate in a criminal enterprise. The community could have questioned how a local real estate investor suddenly had access to dozens of properties being sold by, quote, financially distressed young people. You could have wondered why so many successful young entrepreneurs were supposedly desperate to liquidate their assets at below-market prices. Mayor Garrett's tone shifted to something colder. Ms. Ashford, I hope you understand that Ridgemont is a small community with long memories. People here value loyalty, and they don't forget when someone comes in from outside and tries to destroy local institutions. Mayor Garrett, I'm not from outside. I grew up in this community. I lived in a trailer park here for 18 years. The difference is that now I have enough money and legal resources to do something about the corruption that people like you have been ignoring because it was profitable. She hung up without responding. The third wave of calls started around 4 p.m., and these were the ones I'd been expecting but dreading. Danny called first, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Lily, what the hell is going on? Dad got a call from Frank Morrison about rent forgiveness and business acquisitions and federal investigations. Morrison seemed to think you're involved somehow. I am involved, Danny, very involved. Involved how? Morrison made it sound like you're some kind of, I don't know, business mogul or something. He kept talking about federal prosecutors and asset seizures and… Danny's voice trailed off as the implications began to hit him. Danny, remember that conversation we had 3 days ago, when you all decided I was delusional and financially unstable? Lily, we were worried about you. That Chen guy showed us evidence. Chen is a criminal, Danny. He's been stealing from young property owners for years, and he used your prejudices about my success to isolate me from family support. Frank Morrison has been knowingly buying stolen properties from Chen's operation, including properties that belong to me. I could hear Danny breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Are you saying you actually do have money, real money? Danny, I'm about to purchase the company that owns your parents' home. Morrison is facing federal fraud charges that could send him to prison for decades. The evidence Chen showed you was fabricated to cover his theft of nearly $200,000 from my accounts. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. When Danny finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. How much money do you have, Lily? Enough to buy Frank Morrison's entire company without taking out a loan. Another long silence. Then, Mom and Dad, they need to know about this. No, Danny, they made their choice based on information they chose to believe. They decided I wasn't welcome in their home because they thought I was lying about my success. I'm not going to rescue them from the consequences of that decision just because those consequences are getting uncomfortable. But if Morrison's company goes under, they could lose the trailer. Where are they supposed to go? I don't know, Danny. Where did they suggest I go when they decided I was mentally ill and banned me from family gatherings? Lily, come on. They were scared and confused. They thought they were helping you. They were scared and confused because it was easier to believe I was delusional than to accept that their assumptions about my limitations were wrong. They chose to believe a stranger's lies rather than trust their own daughter's documented success. So what happens now? I looked out the window of my penthouse at the city lights below, thinking about Frank Morrison sitting in his office, probably drinking heavily and calculating his legal exposure. I thought about Mayor Garrett making phone calls to other local officials, trying to figure out how to contain a situation that was about to explode beyond anyone's ability to manage it. Now, Danny, your parents get to discover exactly how real their delusional daughter's success actually is. And Frank Morrison gets to explain to federal prosecutors how he built his local empire on money stolen from people like me. And then what? Then I decide whether the people who threw me away deserve a place in the life I built without them. I hung up and turned off my phone. Tomorrow, Morrison would either accept my acquisition offer or face federal prosecution without my protection. Either way, my parents were about to learn that their landlord had been stealing from their daughter, and their daughter was about to become their landlord. The family that had rejected me for being too successful was about to discover that I was successful enough to own their entire world. Friday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharp and decisive. I woke up at dawn, not because I'd set an alarm, but because my body seemed to understand that today was the day everything would shift permanently in my favor. Morrison had until 5 p.m. to accept my acquisition offer, and based on the increasingly frantic voicemails he'd left throughout the night, I was confident he understood his options. At 9 a.m., I was sitting in Patricia Wong's conference room with Marcus Rivera, Agent Foster, and 2 federal prosecutors who'd driven down from the regional office. The meeting had been scheduled to coordinate the timing of Morrison's decision with the broader federal investigation, but it had evolved into something more significant: the final strategy session for what would become the largest rural property fraud prosecution in the region's history. Ms. Ashford, said Prosecutor James Chen, no relation to Harrison, thankfully, "Your cooperation has been instrumental in building this case, but I want to make sure you understand what's about to happen. Once Morrison accepts your offer and agrees to cooperate, we're going to move fast: simultaneous arrests, asset seizures, and property forfeitures across 3 states. This is going to be front-page news for weeks." "I understand," I said. "How much visibility should I expect personally?" Agent Foster consulted her notes. "You'll be identified as both a victim and a key witness. Your business success and the fraudulent targeting you experienced will be part of the public narrative. Given your local connections, there's going to be significant media interest in the hometown angle." I thought about my parents reading newspaper headlines about their delusional daughter being the central figure in a federal fraud prosecution. I thought about them realizing that every assumption they'd made about my mental state and financial situation had been not just wrong but spectacularly publicly wrong. "That's exactly what I want," I said. At 11 a.m., I drove to Ridgemont for what I knew would be a carefully orchestrated piece of theater. I'd arranged to meet with Morrison at his office at noon, but first, I had a stop to make at the Ridgemont Diner, the local gathering place where information traveled faster than anywhere else in town. The diner hadn't changed since I was a teenager. Red vinyl booths, chrome fixtures, and a counter where the same group of retired men had been drinking coffee and solving the world's problems for the past 20 years. I took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee from Betty Morrison, Frank's sister-in-law, who'd been working there since before I was born. "Well, if it isn't little Lily Ashford," Betty said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Haven't seen you around here in ages. Heard you've been living up in Millbrook, playing businesswoman." The playing businesswoman comment told me everything I needed to know about how my story had been circulating through the local gossip network. Chen's narrative about my supposed delusions had clearly taken root. "That's right, Betty. Actually, I'm here on business today. Meeting with your brother-in-law about some property investments." Betty's expression shifted slightly. "Property investments? With Frank?" "Among other things. It's amazing how much opportunity there is in rural real estate when you have the right capital and connections." I said it loud enough for the coffee counter crew to hear, and I watched the information ripple through the diner like a stone thrown into still water. Within minutes, I could see people discreetly pulling out their phones to share this unexpected development with their networks. At exactly noon, I walked into Morrison's office for the last time. He looked like he'd aged 5 years since our previous meeting, pale, unshaven, wearing the same suit from yesterday. His desk was covered with legal documents, financial statements, and what appeared to be several empty coffee cups. "Ms. Ashford," he said without standing up, "I've reviewed your offer with my attorneys." And he slid a signed document across his desk. "I accept your terms: full acquisition, cooperation with federal investigators, public acknowledgement of past business practices. I picked up the document and reviewed his signature. Excellent. The financial transfer will be completed by close of business today. Federal agents will be here Monday morning to begin the formal cooperation process. Morrison nodded slowly. There's something else. About your parents' rental situation. What about it? I've waived all outstanding late fees and rent obligations through the end of the year, clean slate. I studied his face, trying to determine whether this was genuine remorse or calculated self-preservation. That's generous of you, Mr. Morrison. It's the right thing to do, and honestly, after learning who you really are, I understand why you might have some strong feelings about how your family was treated. Do you, Mr. Morrison? Do you understand that while you were profiting from Harrison Chen's theft of my assets, my parents were struggling to pay rent to you? Do you understand that the same criminal network you were supporting had convinced my family that their daughter was mentally ill? Morrison's face flushed. I had no idea about the personal connection. If you'd known what? That one of Chen's victims was the daughter of your tenants? Would that have made the theft more real to you? Would it have made the other victims more deserving of justice? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. I stood up and extended my hand. Mr. Morrison, as of today, you work for me. I expect the same level of professionalism you've shown your previous business partners, minus the criminal activity. We'll discuss your ongoing role in the company next week. After leaving Morrison's office, I drove straight to the FBI field office for what Agent Foster had described as the final briefing before execution. The conference room was packed with agents, prosecutors, financial analysts, and representatives from 3 different state attorney general offices. Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Foster announced as I took my seat, as of 1 hour ago, we have Frank Morrison's signed cooperation agreement and full access to Ridgemont Properties' financial records. We are officially go for Monday morning operations. She pulled up a map on the large screen that showed arrest locations across 3 states. Simultaneous arrests at 6 a.m. Eastern. Harrison Chen and 17 associates. Asset seizures at 43 locations. Property forfeitures estimated at over $12 million. Prosecutor Chen leaned forward in his chair. Ms. Ashford, I want to personally thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your evidence and testimony have made this prosecution possible. What happens to the other victims? I asked. Full restitution from seized assets, plus civil recovery options against all participants in the network. Based on our current asset inventory, we expect most victims to recover 100% of their losses, plus damages. Agent Foster added, we're also working with state regulatory agencies to implement new oversight requirements for property management companies. Your experience has exposed systemic vulnerabilities that go well beyond this particular criminal network. As the meeting concluded and I walked back to my car, I realized that in less than 72 hours, I'd transformed from an isolated fraud victim into the catalyst for a federal prosecution that would reshape real estate fraud enforcement across multiple states. But the most significant transformation was still ahead of me. Monday morning, when the arrests began and the news broke, my parents would wake up to discover that their delusional daughter was the hero of a major federal criminal case. They'd learn that their landlord had been stealing from me while they were struggling to pay rent to him. They'd understand that the business success they'd refused to believe was real enough to bring down an entire criminal network. The daughter they'd rejected for being fake was about to be validated in the most public way possible. And for the first time in my life, I held all the power in our relationship. The question now was what I would choose to do with it. Monday morning arrived with the precision of a coordinated military operation. At exactly 6 a.m. Eastern, while I was drinking coffee in my penthouse and watching the sunrise over Millbrook, federal agents were simultaneously kicking down doors across 3 states. Harrison Chen was arrested at his luxury home in Tampa. Frank Morrison was taken into custody at his office, where he'd apparently spent the night preparing for what he knew was coming. 17 other associates were arrested at locations from Georgia to Virginia, By 7 a.m., my phone was ringing with calls from reporters who'd been tipped off about the raids. By 8 a.m., the first news vans were setting up outside the Ridgemont Properties office. By 9 a.m., the story was trending on social media, with hashtags like #RuralPropertyFraud and #MillionaireDaughter. I didn't answer the calls or respond to the interview requests. Instead, I drove to Ridgemont. The town was buzzing with an energy I'd never seen before. Police cars, federal vehicles, and news crews had transformed the sleepy Main Street into something resembling a movie set. People stood in small groups outside the diner, the post office, and the hardware store, all of them talking animatedly about the morning's events. I parked outside the diner and sat in my car for a moment, watching the controlled chaos. Through the large front windows, I could see the place was packed beyond capacity, with people spilling out onto the sidewalk. Everyone in Ridgemont was here, trying to make sense of what had happened to their quiet community. Betty Morrison was visible through the window, gesticulating wildly as she spoke to a crowd gathered around the counter. I could only imagine the conversation. Her brother-in-law arrested by federal agents, their family business now owned by little Lily Ashford from the trailer park, the entire foundation of local real estate deals, revealed to be built on criminal activity. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Foster. "Arrests complete. Chen in custody. Media briefing at 2 p.m. You ready for this?" I texted back, "More than ready." At 10 a.m., I drove to Maple Street, to the trailer park where I'd grown up. I parked across from my parents' double-wide and sat there for 20 minutes, watching the familiar scene. Dad's rusted pickup truck in the driveway. Mom's flower boxes on the front steps that she tended with religious devotion. The American flag hanging from the porch that had been there since I was 12 years old. It looked exactly the same as it had when I left for college 8 years ago, except now I owned it. Not just the trailer, but the land it sat on, the entire trailer park, and the investment company that controlled dozens of similar properties across the region. At 10:30, my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen. "Lily?" Her voice was shaking. "Lily, are you there?" "I'm here, Mom." "Honey, I don't understand what's happening. There are police cars everywhere, and people are saying Frank Morrison was arrested, and someone at the diner said, they said you bought his company? They said you're involved with the FBI." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Mom, where are Dad and Danny right now?" "They're here. We're all here. We've been watching the news all morning, and they keep showing pictures of Harrison Chen, that man who came to see us last week. They're saying he's a criminal, that he was stealing money from young business owners and—" Her voice broke. "Lily, were you telling the truth? About your business, about the money, about everything?" "Yes, Mom, I was telling the truth about everything." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "How much money do you have, Lily?" "Enough to buy Frank Morrison's entire company without borrowing a penny. Enough to be the key witness in a federal fraud prosecution. Enough to own the trailer park you live in." Another long silence. "Then, you own our home?" "As of Friday afternoon, yes." I could hear her crying now, soft sobs that she was trying to muffle. In the background, I could hear Dad's voice asking what was wrong, and Danny saying something about turning up the television volume. "Lily," Mom said through her tears, "we made a terrible mistake. We should have believed you. We should have trusted you. That man, that Chen person, he seemed so official, so concerned, and we've been worried about you for so long, wondering how you could afford everything, and when he showed up with explanations that made sense. Mom, you chose to believe a stranger's lies rather than your own daughter's documented success. You banned me from family gatherings because you thought I was mentally ill. You made that choice based on your own assumptions about my limitations, not on any evidence Chen provided." "We were scared," she said. "We didn't understand how someone like you, someone from here, could become so successful so quickly, It didn't seem possible. Someone like me? What does that mean, Mom? Someone from Ridgemont, someone from our family, someone who grew up in a trailer park with parents who never went to college. We thought people like us don't get to have those kinds of success stories. And there it was. The truth I'd been dancing around for years. The real reason my family had been so eager to believe I was delusional. It wasn't just that they couldn't understand my success. It was that my success challenged their fundamental beliefs about what people from their background were capable of achieving. Mom, I need you to understand something. I didn't succeed despite being from Ridgemont. I succeeded because I refused to accept the limitations you thought were inevitable. Every time you told me to be realistic, every time Dad said people like us don't get lucky breaks, every time you suggested I settle for less, you were asking me to give up on the person I was becoming. We thought we were protecting you from disappointment. You were protecting yourselves from having to question why you settled for disappointment. The line went quiet again. In the background, I could hear a news reporter's voice describing the, quote, sophisticated fraud network that targeted young entrepreneurs across the Southeast. Lily, Mom said finally, what happens now? To us, I mean, to our family. I looked at the trailer where I'd spent the first 18 years of my life, where I'd dreamed of escaping to something bigger, where I'd been told those dreams were unrealistic fantasies. I thought about the 8-year-old girl who'd hidden library books about computers under her mattress. I thought about the teenager who'd stayed after school to use the computer lab because her family couldn't afford internet. I thought about the college student who'd worked 3 jobs to pay for an education her parents thought was a waste of time. I don't know, Mom. You threw me away because you thought I was fake. You're going to have to prove that the regret you're feeling now is more real than the doubt you chose to believe then. How do we do that? I don't know, but I do know that it's going to require more than apologies. It's going to require you to genuinely understand why you were so eager to believe I was lying about my success. I hung up and sat in my car for another hour, watching the trailer where my family was presumably having the most difficult conversation of their lives. At noon, I drove back to Millbrook to prepare for the FBI's press conference. By 2 p.m., I was standing beside Agent Foster in front of a room full of reporters, cameras, and federal officials. The questions came fast and focused. How long had the investigation been ongoing? How much money was involved? How many victims had been identified? When a reporter asked about my role in the investigation, Agent Foster gestured for me to step forward. Ms. Ashford is both a victim of this fraud network and the key witness whose cooperation made this prosecution possible, she said. Her courage in coming forward despite personal attacks on her credibility has potentially saved dozens of other young entrepreneurs from similar victimization. A reporter from the regional newspaper raised her hand. Ms. Ashford, we understand that your own family was initially convinced by the perpetrators that your business success was fabricated. How does it feel to be vindicated so publicly? I looked directly into the camera and thought about my parents watching this press conference from their trailer, finally understanding exactly how wrong they'd been about their daughter. It feels like justice, I said, not just for me, but for every young person who's been told their dreams are too big for their circumstances. The reporter followed up. What's next for you personally? I smiled, thinking about the company I now owned, the federal prosecution I'd helped build, and the family that would have to decide whether they wanted to be part of the life I'd created without them. Next, I'm going to use the platform this case has given me to make sure no other young entrepreneur has to choose between family acceptance and personal success. And I'm going to prove that sometimes the best thing you can do for people who don't believe in you is to succeed so spectacularly that their disbelief becomes impossible to maintain. As I walked out of that press conference, I realized I'd spent 26 years trying to earn my family's pride. Now, for the first time in my life, I didn't need it anymore. The question was whether they would prove worthy of mine. 6 months later, I was standing in the conference room of what was now called Ashford Community Properties, looking out at a view that encompassed half of Ridgemont. The former Ridgemont Properties building had been completely renovated. Gone were Frank Morrison's ego wall of political photos and community awards, replaced with a clean, modern space that reflected the company's new mission. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first few weeks after the federal arrests had been chaos. Media attention that never seemed to end, legal proceedings that required constant testimony, and a community that didn't know how to process the fact that their most successful local businessman had been a criminal, and their most successful native daughter had been the one to bring him down. But chaos, I'd discovered, was just another word for opportunity. The knock on my office door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called, turning away from the window. My assistant, Maria Santos, poked her head in. "Your 2 p.m. appointment is here." I checked my watch. Right on time. Send them in. The door opened wider, and my parents walked into my office for the first time since I'd purchased the company. Mom was wearing what I recognized as her best dress, the one she usually reserved for church and funerals. Dad had on a tie, which meant this meeting was as important to them as it was to me. They both stopped just inside the doorway, taking in the office that had once belonged to Frank Morrison, the man who'd collected their rent for 15 years. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. "Lily," Mom said quietly, "thank you for agreeing to see us." I gestured to the 2 chairs across from my desk. "Please, sit down." For the first few minutes, we engaged in the kind of careful small talk that happens between people who are trying to rebuild trust from scratch. They asked about the business, about the ongoing federal prosecution, about my plans for the company. I answered their questions professionally, maintaining the distance that 6 months of silence had created between us. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. "Lily, we owe you an explanation, and an apology. A real one, not just sorry we were wrong, but sorry for why we were wrong." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm listening." Mom reached into her purse and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. She placed it on my desk with shaking hands. It was the front-page story from the Ridgemont Gazette about the federal prosecution, with my photo prominently featured under the headline, "Local Woman Exposes Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud Network." "We've read everything," she said, "every article, every interview, every court document that's been made public. We understand now what you accomplished, what you built, what you risked to bring those criminals to justice. But more than that," Dad added, "we understand what we did to you. How we chose to believe the worst possible explanation for your success because it was easier than admitting we'd been wrong about your potential." I studied their faces, looking for signs of the same patronizing doubt that had characterized our relationship for so many years. What I saw instead was something I'd never seen from them before: genuine respect mixed with what looked like awe. "The hardest part," Mom continued, "was realizing that we raised you to be exactly the person you became: smart, determined, unwilling to accept limitations. But then we punished you for becoming that person because it challenged our own acceptance of those limitations. We spent your whole childhood telling you that you were capable of more than we'd achieved," Dad said. "Then when you actually achieved more, we convinced ourselves you were lying about it because the alternative was admitting that we'd chosen to settle for less than we were capable of." I felt something shift inside my chest, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition. For the first time, they were taking responsibility not just for being wrong about my success, but for the deeper psychological dynamics that had made them want to be wrong. "There's something else," Mom said, reaching into her purse again. She pulled out a thick manila envelope and placed it on my desk. "We've been working with a financial counselor for the past 4 months, trying to understand how we got so deep into debt, why we've struggled financially for so many years when other families in similar situations have managed to build stability." I opened the envelope and found detailed financial records, budgets, and what appeared to be a comprehensive debt restructuring plan. "We discovered," Dad said, "that a lot of our financial problems came from choices we made based on the same limiting beliefs that made us doubt your success. We convinced ourselves that people like us don't deserve nice things, so we never learned how to manage money properly. We told ourselves that financial planning was for rich people, so we never developed the skills to build wealth gradually. Mom nodded. The counselor helped us understand that we were so focused on just surviving paycheck to paycheck that we never learned how to think strategically about money. And when you tried to teach us about business and investment and long-term planning, we dismissed it as fantasy because it didn't match our experience. What we're saying, Dad continued, is that we don't just want to apologize for not believing in your success. We want to apologize for not raising you with the financial literacy and strategic thinking that would have made your success less surprising to us. I looked at the financial documents they'd prepared. It was clear they'd spent significant time and effort understanding not just their current situation, but the psychological patterns that had created it. This wasn't just an apology. It was evidence of genuine self-reflection and change. "There's one more thing," Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We know we don't deserve forgiveness. We know that the damage we did to our relationship might be permanent. But if you're willing, we'd like to learn from you. Not just about business or money, but about how to think bigger. How to believe in possibilities. How to support each other's growth instead of limiting it." Dad leaned forward in his chair. "We'd like to understand how you built what you built, not because we want to copy it, but because we want to understand the mindset that made it possible. We want to learn how to be the parents who could have raised a daughter like you without being threatened by her success." I stood up and walked back to the window, looking out at the community I now had the power to reshape. 6 months ago, I'd sat in this same view planning revenge against people who'd underestimated me. Today, I was looking at an opportunity to do something more constructive with the power I'd gained. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, turning back to face them. "You're going to start working for me, not as employees, but as community liaisons for Ashford Community Properties. You're going to help me identify families who are struggling financially, not because they're lazy or irresponsible, but because they've never been taught how to think strategically about money." Their eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like hope. "You're going to help me develop programs that teach financial literacy, business planning, and wealth-building strategies to people who've been told that economic success isn't for people like them. You're going to use your own experience of limiting beliefs to help other families recognize and overcome those same limitations." Mom started crying, not the desperate tears of 6 months ago, but tears of relief and purpose. "And," I continued, "you're going to do this not as penance for doubting me, but as partners in building the kind of community support system that could have helped our family think bigger from the beginning." Dad wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "You're giving us a chance to be part of what you're building?" "I'm giving you a chance to help other families avoid the mistakes that almost cost us our relationship. I'm giving you an opportunity to turn your hard-earned understanding of limiting beliefs into a tool that helps other people break through those same barriers." As my parents left my office that day carrying new employment contracts and a renewed sense of purpose, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't defeating the criminals who'd tried to destroy me. It wasn't even proving my family wrong about my capabilities. The greatest victory was discovering that the power I'd gained could be used not just to punish people who'd underestimated me, but to help them become the people they should have been all along. Today, Ashford Community Properties manages over 200 affordable housing units across 3 counties. We've helped 47 families transition from renting to home ownership through our financial literacy programs. We've provided startup funding for 18 small businesses owned by people who'd been told that entrepreneurship wasn't for people like them. And every time a young person from a working-class family tells me their dreams seem too big for their circumstances, I tell them about a girl from a trailer park who refused to accept other people's limitations and ended up owning the company that used to collect her parents' rent. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong about your potential. Sometimes it's proving that their limitations were never yours to accept in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.